Hi, and a very warm welcome to session 3 of today's Category Palooza. And I'm delighted to have joining me for today's session Tanya Manning-Grant. She's the CEO of TMG Professional Services Consulting Firm, and she's one of our SpendPros. And our topic today is driving supply chain value in disrupted times. And I know that's a topic that's at the top of the agenda for lots of our attendees. So a very warm welcome to you today, Tanya.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you for having me.
So I'd just like to echo the request from the past sessions, which is questions are very, very welcome. You can put those in the chat window, which is below your screen, and we'll be having a look at them, and I'll be putting them to Tanya during the session. Okay, so let's get started. Tanya, for our participants that don't know you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what your experience is and just a bit of your background, please?
Absolutely. Thank you, Helen. So I have been in supply chain procurement operations close to 34 years at various levels and at various roles. I have been a senior management consultant. I have been a vice president of client relationship management and eventually starting my own consulting firm. So I have worked with several CPG companies in terms of helping them manage their indirect spend across several different categories, such as professional services, MRO, retail operations, packaging, corporate services. And so I have been very in tune with this particular topic for a very long time. And I think it's very important now that I am a small business owner, not just with a consulting firm. So taking my 34 years and aggregating everything that I've known and every company that I've worked for and every company that I've supported to now help support small to medium-sized businesses sort of navigate this supply chain world. And on top of that, I am also the owner of two boutiques, a children's clothing boutique, Ashton's Corner, and then also a women's clothing boutique, Dress Code by TMG.com. But my passion still remains with supply chain and procurement operations.
Oh, well, so you've got both sides of the equation then in terms of being a retailer and getting goods for resale, but also on the other side dealing with the not for resale side of things as well. So that's lots of experience to bring to the conversation today. So really looking forward to it. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the first topic then. And, we've called this section moving past just getting by. And I think it's certainly been a time of disruption, sustained disruption for people. And I'd be really interested, Tanya, in what you think the key factors are for, taking things beyond the tactical of just getting by and what you've seen from your work with clients, how they're getting on, what have you been putting to them in terms of making that change and getting through the period we've been through.
And I think this session, the work that you, Kelly and Philip are doing is amazing. And I think this session is so warranted for companies of various sizes. And so before I get into that, the first thing that I would like to say is all about mindset. There's 3 key words that I talk to my clients about and that I also, try to incorporate into my strategy in terms of trying to maneuver this through this hard time right now as a small business owner. And that is responsibility, resiliency, and pivot. Responsibility is taking a step back and taking some ownership of your numbers, ownership of your ecosystem, ownership of your business. Resiliency. Don't be resistant to change. I have seen so many companies right now, Helen, not necessarily want to make change within their own business models because it is so risky. And they have a tendency to drive towards what's safe and what feels safe. And that may not always be the right strategy to incorporate, particularly during these times. And then also pivot, being ready to make those changes, being ready to take some of those risks. So those companies that I have worked for or worked with that have displayed those 3 key pieces of a mindset, willing to make some changes, have been pretty successful in terms of navigating during these choppy waters. So I just want to start with a few statistics that I've been able to garner. And so it sort of sets the landscape of what I want to talk about here. There are about 94% of companies that are experiencing some type of supply chain issues right now, based upon what we've seen in terms of the war in Ukraine, what we're seeing in terms of COVID. Now, monkeypox is upon us. So we're having to, sort of deal with something like that. 75% of those companies that reported issues are saying that it is impacting revenues, is impacting customer satisfaction, is impacting their ability to do business effectively. And about 55% of those companies are saying, look, we need to rethink our supply chain model. We need to either stop the current growth trajectory that we are on. We need to revisit our current supplier ecosystem. We need to sort of manage cash flows much better. So there are about 55% of those companies saying we need to make some changes. And I'm not surprised about that. Not surprised about that at all. So when I look at those numbers compared to the numbers that I saw come in from the poll, I think they line up very nicely. And I think what we're seeing out of that 55% that perceive that they need to make some type of change, 58% of that said through their supplier ecosystem. So I think that's very smart to say that there needs to be a different level of engagement and or partnership with their suppliers. But when I take a look at the 19% seeking alternative services and 15% saying, hey, we need to rethink our buying strategies, and 8% focus on demand management, those bottom three, 2 through 4, rolls into and can be managed and or executed with the level of supplier engagement relationships that you develop. So our stats are saying that is where companies need to focus in on. And so what I like to say is there are 4 key factors that you and I talked about. And in those 4 key factors, the first one is, let's go back and take a look at how do we evaluate our supplier ecosystem. And I think a lot of that has to do with the vernacular. I'm still hearing quite a bit in our field or in our business, vendor. So when you think about that term vendor, the perception is someone that is simply selling goods and services. And what I have encouraged my clients and even myself when I am negotiating for my own businesses is to sort of change my mindset to say, I'm looking for more of a partner in this area, someone that could come to the table with capabilities that I may not have, or capabilities that will assist me in overcoming some of the obstacles that are out there in the marketplace. So what I am challenging people to do is go back and revisit your supplier ecosystem, understanding what type of SRM, supplier relationship management program, have you implemented. You'd be surprised the number of companies that I have supported that do not necessarily have an SRM program or an effective SRM program. So they really have not taken advantage of supplier capabilities. So in doing so and putting a program in place, it really helps to drive and navigate us through these choppy times, because more often than not, I have found that suppliers have what I like to call a disaster recovery plan in place, right? Because quite often they have to focus in on losing business, pivoting businesses, so they understand that piece of what we're trying to go through. So I have challenged a lot of people to go back and assess their suppliers, understanding what their supplier capabilities are in terms of how can we aggregate more business towards key partners. Because as you start to navigate business towards key partners, you're able to negotiate better rates. You've been able to negotiate, new SOWs, new contract terms. You've been able to negotiate, a whole host of activities that would be able to have you or to allow you to drive down cost. I also talk a lot about understanding current conditions, focusing in on those suppliers that really have a handle on what's happening in the marketplace, that are following the CPIs, and helping to bring strategies or best practices that they're seeing in the marketplace back to you. So we're seeing upwards of, I think I pulled some stats to say that upwards of 8% over the past 12 months, we're seeing pricing go up, and that's changing per industry, per category. And I think I saw gas prices are up 18%. Grocery store prices are up 1.5%. We're seeing healthcare cost rising substantially. So when you're working with a lot of your supplier partners, they can come to the table with strategies to help offset some of that, or alternative buys, what I like to call alternative buys. That means that, do you have a widget or a gadget that can move from customization to standardization? Quite often in my past life working with, a certain CPG company, we would look at equipment and we would assess that equipment in terms of repair versus replace. And quite often when you looked at it, it was actually much more cost effective to repair as opposed to replace. But what really drove the cost is there's a lot of customization happening in the marketplace. Is that necessarily necessary for a lot of standardized equipment? So it's having that mindset to say, how do I standardize some parts and pieces that I'm utilizing versus constantly customizing things? And so working with your supply base to help understand that, I think, is very critical. What I also think is very important is utilizing that strategy of vendor consolidation. We have this mindset of quite often, well, if I have 3 or 4 suppliers providing me with certain services, it offers more of a competitive landscape. In some instances, that is absolutely true, because you want to make sure that you maintain a competitive market. But when we are sitting in the times that we are sitting in right now, it behooves us as buyers of these services to really go back and take a look and say, if we have certain suppliers that have been partnering with us extremely well, they have a great handle on the marketplace, they're leading in certain key areas, how do we consolidate what I like to call low level, low fruit hanging spend into those providers and open up contracts, renegotiate SOWs, renegotiate payment terms, renegotiate thresholds in terms of prebates, rebates, those sort of things. So being able to take advantage of that vendor consolidation piece. What I also think is very key in helping to manage what we're seeing today is, don't be afraid to step outside the box. We're seeing a fast growing rate of boutique type firms that can take on some of the work away from some of these larger firms. And I will tell you that you may say, well, that's different than what you just spoke about, Tanya. And you're offering different strategies, right? There's not one cookie cutter strategy that's going to work for every company, but there may not be a cookie cutter strategy that is going to work within the same company. So you can use different strategies within the same ecosystem. So for instance, there's a rapid growth, as I was saying, of boutique type firms. And even within that boutique type firms, we're seeing an increase into the marketplace of diverse firms. Supplier diversity is so important. I can't speak enough on that. There are some firms out there that I've worked with that have very structured, organized goals, and they're really driving towards utilizing and or incorporating diverse suppliers into their mix. So much so that they're offering training programs, they're offering certification programs, they're offering a whole host of opportunities to help those diverse suppliers grow. A different level of education. And I've seen some companies that are slow to the table or slow to the take. But working with more boutique firms, more diverse firms, I think offers you a certain level of innovation, a certain level of hungriness that these suppliers want to be able to play in the space. So they're going to be a lot more forward thinking. They're going to have thought leaders that are going to join the table that will allow you to sort of think outside the box. So I tell my clients, don't be afraid to engage with boutique suppliers. Do not be afraid to engage with diverse suppliers. Not to say that you're switching your entire program over today or tomorrow, because some of them may not be prepared. But when you engage and start building those partnerships, understanding capabilities, understanding, their niche, you start to sort of expand on that, build that out. That can work to your advantage. So staying focused in on right now, I think it's really important to really think outside the box and start looking at other suppliers, other alternative, other sources. I also talk to a lot of my clients about joining buying groups, consortiums, if you will. There's a lot of power out there with consortiums. And I'm seeing a lot more small, privately held businesses, medium-sized businesses, such as myself, growing or joining those types of consortium, because with that, you have an aggregation of buying power. So you can take advantage of companies that have a much larger spend. Also, it gives a lot of these minority firms, these diverse firms, exposure if they're joining some of these buying groups, because a lot of the larger companies that we're seeing out there don't necessarily have visibility into some of these boutique firms and some of these smaller diverse firms. So, and they are part of consortium. So that's another way to gain visibility into buying alternatives. And that's another way for some of these smaller firms to get exposure. I think reciprocity is a key to success when we're talking about leveraging our ecosystem. So working with some of these alternative sources, helping them grow, helping them to expand, also benefits a company, because they're going to make sure that you're a priority within their portfolio. So that's the level of reciprocity that I'm seeing that is having very positive impacts, Helen. I think also looking at offshore versus onshore capabilities. So, how do you move some of your, I want to say, less strategic work offshore? So, you're taking advantage of lower rate cards. You're not saying that you're delivering on less quality, because you're not delivering less quality, but you're able to offshore some of your less strategic work, more of that day to day mundane work, sort of what I like to call the minutia, and keeping more of your strategic onshore. So you're working with those suppliers that have that capability. So what I have done is spent quite a bit of time understanding what some of the key players' operations look like offshore versus onshore, because you're not going to find that as much with some of the diverse suppliers or some of the smaller boutique type suppliers. But again, sticking with some of the guys that have stuck it out with you, working with some of the, like I like to call, some of the bigger major vendors in the marketplace, challenge them on their offshore capabilities. Look at what they're capable of doing. Talk to them about what they're doing for some of your competitors, what they're doing in the marketplace, and starting to shift some of that work over there. Now, granted, people have said, Tanya, there's some challenges with that. So you're looking at time zones, you're looking at cultural differences, you're looking at language barriers, but those are things that you can overcome. Those are things that you can work through that will help you, because when you take a look at the cost versus the risk, it's worth the risk, because you're going to help reduce some of the cost. Mm-hmm. You're not looking to drive a lot of the, what I like to call, a company strategic initiatives over offshore. In some instances, you may be able to if it's well developed, but for the most part, it's moving over some of that strategic, that daily minutia type work. Helps a lot of companies sort of save on that end. I also, talk to a lot of companies about making sure that you're tracking the CPI, that you're being able to plan ahead effectively. So working with those suppliers and looking at what CPIs really drive the levers in your business, and really understanding the total implications, and then creating strategies around those implications. And so I'm having companies look out 6 months in advance, 12 months in advance, to see what that is going to look like, and being able to pivot. It goes back to that word that I started out with much earlier, being able to pivot strategies, being able to incorporate strategies. And I think what's really part of that is around that CPI is developing what I like to call a recovery plan. So how do we get through this time, looking at our supplier ecosystem, looking at buying alternatives, looking at how do we control demand, and then also looking at a fourth prong is human capital. Right now, we are experiencing what is called the Great Resignation. We have a lot of people with years of experience, Helen, with years of relational indicators with a lot of these suppliers leaving companies, shifting companies, or going out on their own. I'm seeing more and more, small firms like mine growing and expanding. And so how do we retain that talent? What are we doing to retain that intellectual capital that leaves when individuals leave? So what are we doing? So what I'm advising a lot of companies to do right now is revisiting strategies around retaining people, retaining that knowledge, and then also how do we advance that knowledge? A lot of companies that are investing in artificial intelligence, data analytics, are also able to weather this storm. So it's taking what is in here and getting it down into a repository, whatever that looks like for you, and helping to utilize that level of information to help make decisions moving forward. That becomes part of this recovery plan. So I think we really need to focus in on that. Yeah. What I also think is very critical during this time is being able to segment your suppliers effectively. I think a lot of times companies don't really invest in that, but really understanding supplier segmentation. And that's based upon how much you're spending with this supplier, how much it's costing you to spend with these suppliers, where does these supplier partners fit within their own ecosystem, within their own industry, getting references on a lot of these suppliers. Because when you work with a lot of suppliers, you hear a lot of those, I like to call good feel stories or win-wins. What I like to hear when I am investing in a new supplier or vetting a new supplier is, give me scenarios where you have fallen down and how did you pick yourself back up? Give me scenarios where you may have lost a bid. Why did you lose the bid? Did you understand why you lost the bid? And how did you recover from that? What strategies did you employ to make sure that the next time that you have an opportunity, that it becomes a win-win for you? How did you help, someone like me, a company like mine, overcome, a situation? What was that level of investment for you? What was that level of investment back to the company? And what does that ROI look like? So being able to segment your suppliers along those lines, I think is very critical as well. And so I would wrap it up to say too, I want to touch on going back for a second to what I like to call GPOs, those group purchasing opportunities. There's so many of them out there, but so many companies are not necessarily aware of them, or I think a lot of times they shy away from them. And so I will implore companies, particularly small to medium-sized firms, to invest in that knowledge, to understand those buying groups. And there's several of them out there, and they bring a lot of positive impacts to you. It can help you drive down rate card increases or price increases. It gives you working knowledge that you may not necessarily have in terms of what's happening in the marketplace, what's happening with CPIs, what other firms are doing to help drive costs down. So I think it's very, very important to invest in the knowledge, the working knowledge, and the understanding of a GPO.
Excellent. Oh, well, what a wealth of knowledge you've given us there, Tanya, for all those different tactics. We've got some questions in the chat, and I'm keen to bring those in. So you've talked a little bit about thinking about the capabilities of suppliers, and for me that made me think it's perhaps not all about cost then. Yes. And we've had some questions in about measuring, how you'd actually measure the value that supplier would bring if we're not, basing it on savings. So here's one I'm going to put up for you now. So
Sure.
how can we capture the measure the innovative ROI of working with a small, diverse boutique supplier? Because you've certainly outlined all the benefits there, but
Yes.
how
Yes.
can we actually measure that and demonstrate the value they're bringing?
I think that's an excellent question. And I think the best way to measure that is delegating a very small, maybe less strategic opportunity towards those suppliers to give them an opportunity to prove out their innovativeness, to prove out their technology, to prove out their understanding of what the ask here is pilot programs. I think pilot programs are wonderful for small, diverse, boutique type opportunities or firms. So if a supplier comes to you and you have an opportunity that maybe not be as impactful to the overall operations, but yet still needs to be executed on, I've seen this happen. I've actually done this myself and had these suppliers perform extremely well, or uncovered some things that they did not necessarily perform well, and have actually challenged me to go back and look at how I am executing on RFPs, on SOWs, that sort of thing. So when you say how can we capture or measure the innovativeness, it is taking that risk that I talked about earlier, being able to pivot some of that business over to these suppliers. But I also want to put a caveat in there too, is to make sure that you establish and you set up a equitable playing field. I have seen situations where when we have invested in these opportunities and brought diverse suppliers on, we have a tendency to hold them at a higher level than we would some of our other suppliers. So we just want to make sure that we make it an equitable playing field, and we establish what those measurements are up front, what those KPIs are up front, and what an expected ROI back is from doing so, to make sure that everybody is completely knowledgeable about those expectations.
Okay, that's great. That was a good outline of what we can do there. I think there's quite a lot of what you were talking about there was about change, about doing things slightly differently. And there's another great question here about energy. A lot of people are feeling a bit ground down by all the things they've had to
Yes.
do. How can we find the energy to drive that change? And I think it links into the final topic that you were going to cover. We've not got a lot of time now, only got a few minutes, but how
Sure.
can we find that energy to help us do this change that you've said there's lots of ways we can do that?
This is an excellent question. And I think a lot of us are actually feeling very fatigued. I call it the economic fatigue. We're all going through this. And I will tell you what I've seen, and what has worked for me is small wins. Is taking a step back and looking at, taking it. So instead of looking at it, eating the elephant in one bite, it's breaking it down and establishing what can you accomplish short term, what can you accomplish long term, and believing in that those short term wins, and sort of like banking on that, if you will, helps to overcome some of the fatigue that we have. I think a lot of it also starts with the top of the house, and being able to say, as partners, we're going to weather the storm. We're going to get through this. But this is how we need to do it. So it has to be a team effort. It has to be all hands on deck. Everyone needs to be moving in the same direction. And I think also what helps is, because what you're really talking about here is change management, is changing mindsets and change management. And I think what helps with that is taking the risk, working to help take the risk or remove the risk of change, finding common grounds in the benefit of such, establishing a roadmap, being structured and effective in establishing a roadmap, and start out with small wins. Small wins lead to gaining people's trust, becoming that trusted advisor, and being willing to listen.
That's brilliant, and that really is nearly the final word. And I was going to ask you if there was one thing people can do as a takeaway from the session, other than the small wins. Is there anything else you just want to pop into there with all the nuggets of wisdom that you've shared as your final thing about taking action?
I would say, guys, we're going to weather this storm. We're going to get through it. Let's just, find common ground. Let's change our vernacular. Let's start looking at our suppliers as partners, and our partners looking at us beyond being a customer, but working together. Reciprocity is going to be key. And then the 3 words that I started off with is responsibility, being able to be resilient and pivot. Having that mindset of change will get us through this.
Thank you so much to my guest today, Tanya Manning-Grant, for all the wisdom that she shared in the session. And thank you so much from the audience for all the questions that you've posed there. There were quite a few specific questions about which GPOs you'd recommend there, Tanya. So if you connect with Tanya on LinkedIn, I'm sure she'll share her knowledge on that subject with you. So our next session is Fine-Tune Jason's Martin in conversation with Andrew Muchler. And they're going to be talking about the real challenges associated with holding the line against suppliers who seem to be holding all the cards. So you can stay here and the stream will automatically change, or go back to the agenda and click on the session. Thank you so much for joining the session, and thank you again to Tanya for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.